Delaware 2004. A case that had haunted a small town for nearly 2 decades was finally on the brink of resolution, and the confession that emerged left residents stunned. Her name was Emily Grace Thompson, 24 years old, a kindergarten teacher with a gentle heart and an infectious laugh. Emily had a way of making children feel safe, seen, and cherished. Then one evening, she disappeared without a trace. Her car was parked outside her apartment in Newark, Delaware, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat, but Emily herself was gone. For years, police followed every lead, interviewed hundreds and pieced together fragments of information, but the trail ran cold. Until now. Before we begin, take a moment and drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Emily Thompson grew up in Newark, Delaware, a close-knit community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Tree-lined streets, local diners with peeling menus, and corner stores with familiar faces framed her childhood. Her mother, Sandra, worked as a nurse, while her father, Mark, was a postal worker. Emily had a younger brother, Jason, and together they spent weekends exploring local parks, attending community events, and riding their bikes through quiet neighborhoods. From a young age, Emily showed a deep curiosity about the world and a natural inclination to care for others. She spent afternoons helping younger students with homework, volunteering at local shelters, and babysitting for neighbors. Her friends often described her as someone who could light up a room with just a smile, a description that seemed almost understated when recalling her presence in classrooms filled with children. Emily's first job in teaching began immediately after earning her degree in early childhood education from the University of Delaware. She preferred working in small, intimate classrooms rather than large institutions, believing that children thrived when they felt noticed and valued. Her classroom was a reflection of her personality, bright, welcoming, and filled with books, toys, and art projects that celebrated creativity and imagination. Every corner told a story of her dedication, patience, and warmth. In addition to teaching, Emily loved photography. Not professional but personal, capturing small moments, the fleeting expressions of children at play, sunsets over the Christina River, friends laughing over coffee. She kept a small collection of her favorite images in albums, often sharing them with her students and neighbors. Photography, like teaching, was a way for Emily to preserve fleeting beauty, a way to make memories last. On October 15, 2004, Emily left her apartment around 5:30 p.m. She told her mother she was going to meet a friend for dinner at a nearby cafe and would return home around 8 p.m. She was calm, cheerful, and as ordinary as any evening she had left for. But she never arrived at the cafe. Her mother, Sandra, called repeatedly that night. Each unanswered ring increased the knot of fear in her chest. By 10 p.m., her father was pacing the living room. At 10:45, they reported her missing to the Newark Police Department. Officers arrived quickly and began piecing together Emily's last known movements. Surveillance footage from the cafe showed no sign of her entering, and neighbors reported seeing her car parked as usual outside her apartment complex. There were no signs of struggle inside her home, no forced entry, nothing to suggest she had left against her will in haste. It was as if she had simply vanished. News of Emily's disappearance spread through Newark rapidly. Flyers were posted, alerts were sent, and the small community mobilized in concern and search efforts. Volunteers combed nearby parks, alleyways, and streets. Local TV stations and newspapers covered every detail, urging anyone with information to come forward. For weeks, tips trickled in, but none provided clarity. Investigators explored every angle. They questioned friends, co-workers, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances. They considered theories of abduction, foul play, or even voluntary disappearance. Nothing fit. Emily's character, her deep bonds with family, and her dedication to her students made the idea that she would leave without notice nearly impossible. Every lead led to a dead end. 2 weeks into the investigation, a new tip emerged from an unexpected source. A local resident remembered seeing a man loitering near Emily's apartment on the night of her disappearance, someone who did not belong in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, the description was vague, and without surveillance footage or physical evidence, the lead stalled. The case began to grow cold, a frustrating reality for detectives, Emily's family, and the community alike. Over the years, the Newark Police Department kept Emily's file active but dormant. Occasionally, a new tip would breathe temporary life into the case, but with no arrests and no definitive evidence, the trail faded again. Her parents refused to close the door on hope. Every birthday, anniversary, and holiday was a quiet reminder of her absence. Community vigils were held annually, and the image of Emily, smiling, bright-eyed, and alive in photographs, remained a poignant symbol of loss. By 2010, most media coverage had moved on, though local residents never forgot. Family, friends, and former students continued sharing stories, holding on to memory and hope, while investigators filed away reports, photographs, and evidence, preserving what might one day reopen the case. The breakthrough came unexpectedly in 2022. Law enforcement in Delaware had begun revisiting cold cases with fresh eyes, incorporating new forensic technology and cross-referencing digital records, social media, and archived communications. Emily's case, with preserved evidence from her apartment and personal belongings, became a candidate for advanced analysis. Forensic specialists re-examined materials previously considered unusable. Fibers, fingerprints, and digital traces were subjected to new techniques that could extract minute details long overlooked. Even old phone records, once impossible to analyze efficiently, were revisited using advanced digital forensics. The process was meticulous, requiring patience and precision, but it revealed something that had been invisible for nearly 2 decades, a traceable pattern of contact pointing to one individual, a man who had been quietly living in Delaware at the time and whose presence had never raised suspicion. As the investigation intensified, detectives tracked financial, communication, and location records. Everything converged on a single person, Thomas Richard Lane, a neighbor who lived a few blocks from Emily's apartment in 2004. At first glance, Lane had appeared ordinary, a quiet man with no criminal history, steady employment and polite interactions with neighbors. But the digital footprint, combined with forensic evidence, painted a different picture. Lane was approached in 2023, facing mounting evidence and the possibility of exposure. He eventually confessed. The confession was precise and chilling, detailing events that had remained a mystery for 19 years. Lane admitted to confronting Emily outside her apartment, an altercation that escalated tragically. He recounted the steps he had taken to conceal his actions, including moving evidence, masking his digital trails, and exploiting the trust of neighbors who never suspected a thing. The confession stunned the community. For nearly 2 decades, residents had lived with fear, unanswered questions, and speculation. Lane's admission brought a combination of relief, sorrow, and disbelief. Emily's family, while devastated by the details, finally received the closure they had long sought. Police recovered additional evidence corroborating Lane's account. Items hidden away in a storage unit provided tangible links to Emily, confirming the confession and ensuring the case could proceed to prosecution without ambiguity. As the arrest and confession became public, Newark was gripped by emotion. News outlets covered the story extensively, focusing not only on the crime, but on the perseverance of law enforcement, the enduring hope of Emily's family, and the impact on the community. Residents organized memorial gatherings, reflecting on Emily's life and the tragedy that had befallen her. This was a case that spanned almost 2 decades, demonstrating both the limitations and the advancements of investigative work. From the initial disappearance to the confession years later, Emily's story became a testament to persistence, forensic innovation, and the power of truth finally coming to light. Even as the trial approached, the community, Emily's family and former students, began the slow process of healing. Memorials were erected, scholarships were established in Emily's name, and the lessons learned from her case influenced investigative practices across the state. The story of Emily Grace Thompson, though born from tragedy, became a symbol of hope, justice, and the enduring impact of one life remembered. The quiet of Newark was pierced not by fear anymore, but by a collective acknowledgement of perseverance, the importance of memory, and the eventual triumph of truth. Emily's legacy, preserved in classrooms, photographs, and community efforts, would continue to inspire. Long after the case was officially closed, the turning point in Emily Grace Thompson's case began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in early 2022. After nearly 18 years, her missing file, tucked away in the Newark Police Department's cold case archives, was dusted off as part of a statewide initiative to review unsolved homicides. Detectives assigned to the project were experienced in cold cases, trained in new forensic technologies, and committed to looking at the evidence. Emily's belongings, preserved meticulously in evidence bags, became the center of renewed attention. Among them were her personal items from the night of her disappearance, a scarf she often wore, her wallet left in her apartment, and the keys to her car that remained parked outside. At the time of the initial investigation, forensic capabilities were limited. Fingerprints could only be lifted if clearly present, and DNA testing required larger samples than what small incidental traces could provide. In 2004, the faint fingerprints and microscopic skin cells found on Emily's belongings were considered inconclusive, but by 2022, forensic science had advanced dramatically. Touch DNA technology had evolved to detect even the most minute traces of skin, sweat, or residue left behind on objects handled by a person. Digital evidence recovery had progressed as well, allowing investigators to extract historical data from old phone records, archived emails, and other digital footprints previously thought inaccessible. A small team began the painstaking work of re-evaluating the evidence. They started with Emily's apartment, analyzing surfaces and objects that had previously been overlooked. The corner of her desk, the back of her door, and her wardrobe handles were swabbed again. Each swab was processed using probabilistic genotyping, a method capable of analyzing highly degraded or mixed DNA samples and identifying potential contributors even years after the fact. The breakthrough came from a modest, unassuming piece of evidence, Emily's keyring, which she always carried and had been found in her apartment untouched. The forensic lab swabbed the metal keys and the ring itself, carefully extracting skin cells from each surface. After weeks of processing, the technicians identified a partial DNA profile, enough to suggest it belonged to someone who had handled the keys extensively, but was not Emily herself. It wasn't a complete match for any person in the CODIS database, but it was a starting point. The detectives turned to genealogical research. They uploaded the partial DNA profile to public ancestry databases that permitted law enforcement searches. Within weeks, they identified familial connections, a web of relatives whose genetic markers indicated a close link to the unknown contributor. One branch of the family tree pointed squarely to a man who had lived in Newark at the time of Emily's disappearance, Thomas Richard Lane. He had been a neighbor in Emily's apartment complex, a quiet man in his early 40s, with a reputation for keeping to himself. In 2004, Lane was unremarkable to those around him. Polite, rarely social, and seemingly without conflict. He had no criminal record, and neighbors described him as normal or private. No one suspected that he would become the subject of one of the most shocking confessions in Delaware's history. Investigators began compiling additional records to confirm Lane's presence and activity. On October 15, 2004, Cell tower data indicated that his phone had been near Emily's apartment that evening, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance. Witness statements from neighbors were re-examined, revealing minor details previously dismissed. A man seen leaving the vicinity at dusk, someone occasionally watching the complex from a distance. Alone, these fragments seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a troubling pattern. Detectives approached Lane carefully. They needed corroboration, not just suspicion. Surveillance, financial records, and digital forensics were cross-referenced to build a comprehensive picture. For example, Lane's bank transactions, modest and routine, showed a withdrawal near the local convenience store roughly half an hour after Emily was last seen. It suggested a short window of activity coinciding with the disappearance. When confronted with the accumulating evidence in 2023, Lane initially denied involvement. He insisted he had been home that evening and had not interacted with Emily. But detectives had an advantage Lane did not anticipate: the forensic evidence connecting him to her belongings, and the timeline reconstructed from digital records. Under continued questioning, the inconsistencies in his story became apparent. By mid-2023, Lane's resistance began to crumble. Facing nearly 2 decades of evidence that now bore the unmistakable mark of modern forensic science, he confessed. The details were disturbing and precise, laying bare the sequence of events that had long remained a mystery. According to Lane, a confrontation had occurred outside Emily's apartment, escalating to violence he later sought to conceal. He described hiding evidence, carefully manipulating his environment to avoid leaving traces, and living in plain sight for nearly 20 years. The confession also revealed items Emily had carried that were taken and hidden, including a small satchel with personal documents and a photo of her classroom students. Law enforcement tracked down these items using information Lane provided. They were remarkably intact, though faded and aged. The recovery corroborated his account, transforming circumstantial evidence into concrete proof. Community reaction to the confession was immediate and intense. For nearly 20 years, residents had speculated, worried, and mourned Emily's absence. The news of Lane's admission brought a mixture of relief, anger, and disbelief. Questions surfaced. How had a man living next door to Emily remained unnoticed? How had a crime of this magnitude stayed hidden for so long? And why had the truth taken so many years to emerge? The family's response was complex. Sandra and Mark Thompson, Emily's parents, had endured almost 2 decades of uncertainty and grief. The confession provided closure, but the years lost could not be reclaimed. Their younger son, Jason, now grown, reflected on the impact of living with the unknown. The family's public statement balanced sorrow with gratitude. "We are heartbroken by the details revealed today, but finally knowing the truth allows us to honor Emily's life and move toward healing. We are grateful to the investigators who refused to give up on her case." In the courtroom, the prosecution relied heavily on Lane's confession, supported by the forensic and digital evidence. Investigators explained the advances in touch DNA, the careful chain of custody of Emily's belongings, and the corroboration provided by items recovered based on Lane's guidance. The combination of admission and tangible proof created a compelling, nearly irrefutable case. The defense attempted to challenge the validity of evidence, citing the time elapsed and potential contamination over years of storage. They questioned the reliability of genealogical analysis and modern forensic interpretation of older evidence. However, experts in the field provided detailed testimony on procedures, storage conditions, and modern analysis techniques, demonstrating that the integrity of the evidence had been preserved. Outside the courtroom, the town of Newark began the process of reflection. Schools held memorial assemblies, community centers hosted remembrance events, and neighbors shared personal stories of Emily's impact. Her teaching, kindness, and photography had touched countless lives, and these memories now served as a counterbalance to the dark details of her disappearance and murder. In addition to emotional closure, the case sparked changes in investigative protocols. Delaware law enforcement agencies implemented updated procedures for cold case review, emphasizing preservation of evidence, regular re-evaluation of unsolved cases, and the incorporation of new forensic technologies. Emily's case became a model for other jurisdictions, highlighting the potential of touch DNA, digital forensics, and genealogical methods in solving long unsolved crimes. By late 2023, as the trial approached, Emily's story resonated beyond Newark. Local media featured retrospectives on her life, the timeline of her disappearance, and the advances that led to Lane's confession. National outlets reported on the case as an example of persistence, technological advancement, and the power of truth eventually emerging. The community continued memorializing Emily through small acts, planting flowers in her favorite park, creating scholarship funds for aspiring educators, and celebrating her photography in local galleries. Her life, though tragically cut short, became a catalyst for remembrance, education, and justice reform. As Delaware prepared for Lane's trial in early 2024, the focus remained on presenting a clear, factual narrative that highlighted both the human and scientific aspects of the case. Investigators emphasized meticulous evidence handling, careful interpretation of digital records, and the corroboration of the confession with physical proof. In doing so, they honored Emily's life and ensured that the proceedings were thorough, respectful, and grounded in truth. Through the long journey from disappearance to confession, Emily Grace Thompson's story exemplified the intersection of human perseverance and scientific progress. It demonstrated how a case once considered impossible to solve could be cracked through diligence, innovation, and unwavering commitment to justice. The arrest of Thomas Richard Lane was carried out quietly in March 2024, a small, deliberate operation that reflected the caution of law enforcement officials who had watched him for months. Lane, now in his early 60s, lived in a modest townhouse in a quiet Newark suburb. He had adapted to a life of solitude, keeping his routines predictable, blending into the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood. No one would have guessed that a man walking among them carried the two plainclothes officers approached Lane's door mid-morning. The sun cast long shadows across the street, and the neighborhood seemed untouched by the tension of the arrest. Lane answered the door, initially calm but alert. He was read his rights and quietly escorted into a waiting vehicle. There were no outbursts, no dramatic struggle, only the solemn acknowledgement of inevitability. For those officers, it was a quiet victory after years of uncertainty, the culmination of painstaking work across decades of technological evolution and investigative persistence. Inside the Newark Police Department, Lane was processed with meticulous care. His belongings were logged, photographs taken, and fingerprint scans collected. Though decades had passed since Emily's disappearance, procedural rigor remained essential. Lane's prior lack of criminal history meant that no prior templates existed, but investigators had already built a comprehensive profile from the genealogical DNA and confession evidence. The public, however, would not learn of the arrest immediately. Officials coordinated the announcement carefully, allowing investigators to prepare charges, evidence, and court filings to ensure that Lane could not manipulate or evade the proceedings. By early April 2024, the news broke. Delaware 2004 cold case solved, suspect arrested after nearly 2 decades. The headlines shocked the state. Residents of Newark had grown accustomed to a lingering sadness over Emily's disappearance. For almost 20 years, the memory of a young teacher, her absence, and the unanswered questions shaped the quiet moments of their lives. News of Lane's arrest disrupted that silence, sparking a mix of relief, anger, and disbelief. On social media, neighbors recalled seeing him in passing, walking past the apartment complex, taking routine trips to the store, always quiet, always ordinary. How had a man living among them managed to stay hidden for so long? Inside the courtroom, prosecutors moved swiftly to establish the narrative of Emily's final hours. The timeline was reconstructed with meticulous attention to detail. Emily's last known movements, corroborated by witness statements, cell tower records, and bank transactions, were aligned with Lane's location and activities. Each piece of evidence reinforced the story emerging from Lane's confession, a confrontation outside Emily's apartment, followed by the concealment of her belongings and his deliberate efforts to evade detection. The recovered items, hidden for nearly 2 decades, were presented as tangible proof of Lane's actions. Emily's satchel, her wallet, and even the small photo of her student served as powerful testimony. These objects not only corroborated his admission, but also humanized the narrative. Reminding the jury and the public of the life Lane had taken, the defense attempted to challenge every detail, emphasizing the passage of time. Could DNA from 18 years prior be trusted? Could recollections of witnesses be reliable after nearly 2 decades? Could a confession given after so many years truly reflect the facts? Or was it influenced by guilt, coaching, or psychological pressure? The courtroom became a delicate balance of science, law, and human memory. Expert witnesses testified about the advances in touch DNA and probabilistic genotyping, explaining how microscopic traces, long considered unusable, could now provide near-conclusive results. They outlined the care taken in preserving evidence, the chain of custody over decades, and the methodology ensuring that Lane's DNA on Emily's belongings was authentic and untainted. Every step of the process was documented, scrutinized, and explained in clear, accessible terms for the jury. Outside the courtroom, the community grappled with the emotional weight of the trial. Many remembered Emily as the teacher who brought kindness, patience, and understanding into her classroom. Parents recounted stories of her attention to students struggling with family challenges. Former colleagues described her dedication, her quiet determination, and the small, thoughtful ways she made lives better. These remembrances became part of the trial, reinforcing the gravity of the crime and the depth of the loss. Meanwhile, the police and prosecutors emphasized the extraordinary nature of the case. Not only had the crime gone unsolved for almost 2 decades, but it also illustrated the transformative power of modern forensic science and genealogical research. Emily's case became a reference point, demonstrating that no case is truly beyond reach if evidence is preserved and investigators remain diligent. Throughout the trial, Lane remained composed but distant. His demeanor, quiet and inscrutable, contrasted sharply with the grief and emotion of Emily's family. Sandra and Mark Thompson sat in the front row, faces drawn with years of sorrow, holding on to each other as they listened to the details of their daughter's last hours. Their younger son, Jason, now an adult, maintained a respectful silence, wrestling privately with the long shadow cast over their family. Prosecutors presented the confession carefully, emphasizing corroborating details rather than sensationalizing the crime. Lane had admitted to actions that aligned precisely with the recovered evidence, taking Emily's belongings, moving them to concealed locations, and attempting to erase traces of his presence. The confession was not only a verbal acknowledgement, but a guide to the physical evidence, leading investigators to items that had remained hidden for nearly 2 decades. One particularly poignant moment